judgment will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils among the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. He stood in our place, so we wouldn't have to. That entire chapter is a prophecy pointing to how will you know who the Messiah is. Okay? Now, turn with me to Matthew 27. So we started with Matthew. Matthew continues in this process. Matthew 27, starting in verse 32. Now, Matthew is writing about the Christ. Matthew is writing about Jesus. Matthew is writing about what actually happened on the cross when Jesus died. Okay? He's not referring in this back to any prophecy. He's been doing that for chapter upon chapter. When he gets here, he starts just talking. Actually, it's a couple chapters earlier. You won't find any more prophecies. He now is just listing what Christ actually did. Here's what actually happened to Christ. Verse 32. As they were going out, they met the man of Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came and placed to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine and drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head was placed a written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. I love the other gospel, I think it's John, where they try and tell Pilate, hey, don't write that he's the King of the Jews, right? He proclaimed to be. And it's written in 3 different languages over his head, and Pilate goes, what I have written, I have written. Which I think Pilate honestly probably believed. In a sense, now he may not put his faith in him, but he believed because he had this debate with Jesus about what is truth. And Jesus began to answer him. He's one of the few he spoke to in this process of going to the cross. But anyway, it says this, what I've written, let's do that. 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insult on him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourselves. Come down from the cross, if you really are the Son of God. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers, now the religious folks of the law and the elders mocked him. They said, they mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Here's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. Do you believe what they're saying? No, they're not going to believe no matter what happens. And he already told them that. You know, Jesus has gotten so fed up with them toward the end, they kept asking for a sign, and he'd already given them so many. He said, no other sign is going to be given to you anymore, O unbelieving generation, except for the sign of Jonah, who was dead for 3 days in the belly of a great fish and came back. Now, he wasn't dead, but he was gone. Jesus says, that's the only other sign I can give you. If you don't believe that, nothing else is going to work. Now, there's another reason he doesn't bring himself down, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But come down from the cross, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him. Now, let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Does that sound like a fulfillment of Isaiah? Does that sound like a fulfillment? Everybody's going to insult. Everybody's going to ridicule. People aren't going to understand what's happening in those things. But you know, even more important, the reason why Christ couldn't come off the cross and show them that he really was the Son of God is because if he had, we would have all been dead. Do you know, and I can't get into this, but do you know that when Pilate washed his hands in front of them, of the crowds, and said, what do you want me to do with Jesus? Because he's done. He's not going to crucify him, okay? That becomes important in a minute. But Pilate has had him scourged. He's had him whipped within literally inches of the end of his life. And he said, I'm not doing it anymore. This guy's not guilty. He actually says, what is he guilty of? He's not guilty of anything. I beat him just to make y'all happy. I put the stripes on him. I put the iniquity. I put all this on. What else you want me to do? Then they begin to cry out, crucify him, crucify him. And it says in one of the Gospels that somebody in the crowd says, and let his blood be on us and on our children. They didn't know in that moment they were speaking prophecy too. Because Jesus said exactly. He didn't say that, but my guess is he thought exactly. That's why I came. For you and for your children and their children and their children. So I can't come off the cross. I came to fulfill all these prophecies and be who God created me to be and be the sacrifice that I was intended and ordained to be before the foundation of the earth. Okay, now, let's go back to prophecy. Turn with me to Psalms 22. Okay. This one we're going to hit fairly fast, and then I got a video for you. I can't read this whole chapter, I'm not going to, but I want to. I have circled about 10 verses in this chapter that refer directly to what the Messiah is going to do or be or deal with on the cross, okay? In some ways. Verse 1 is one of those, Psalms 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Who said that in Scripture? Jesus, while hanging on a cross. Go down to verse 7. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shake their heads. He trusted in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Didn't we just read that? Now go down to 14. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted away within me. My strength has dried up like a potsherd. And if you look at what happened, they talk about one of the things that happens on the cross and through the scourging of Christ is how dehydrated he ultimately was. His body literally is so dehydrated he goes into shock. And that's going to be important again in a minute. It says, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust and on the dirt. Verse 16, dogs, they've surrounded me. A band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Thousands of years before crucifixion was ever even invented. I can count all my bones. People share and they gloat over me. They divide my garments among themselves, and they cast lots for my clothes. It is what the soldiers did at the bottom of the cross, all four Gospels refer to. That literally, they divided his clothes, but then there was one garment, we'll see at the very end, that was so special, that literally they said, this one's too special, let's not tear it up, we'll cast lots for it. Just to fulfill this prophecy of death. Now go down to 27. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him. This is the fulfillment of what the end time, not on the cross, but what's going to come. Those who cannot keep themselves alive, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, for he has done it. That's us today, okay? With that in mind, I need to show you a video. Roger's going to pull it up and let me give a little bit of quick history. How many of you know about the Shroud of Turin? At least have heard about it, okay? It's supposed to be the burial cloth of Christ. I heard about it probably 4 years ago. And ever since then, I just wonder. And you just go, oh, I want to know more. Now, for me, it didn't take a whole lot because I was like, good enough for me, man. Look at it. But they'd never been allowed until 1978, although they'd had possession of the shroud since 1353. They'd never been allowed to touch it, scientifically test it, or whatever until 1978. And so when I heard about the Shroud of Turin, they were just starting this process of possibly looking at it. They said, because it'll damage it, and we don't want to damage it. Well, they finally found a way to do it. They called in a team of 19 scientists from all different, and people from all different kind of skills, from photographers to forensic scientists to blood analysis to botanists to archaeologists to people who were skilled in just material that is made out of, all those kind of things. Just so you know how intense their study was, they took 19 months just to set up and talk about what they were going to do when the shroud was available to them. Now here's the great thing, when they tested it, those results, which is really cool and kind of important, I'm just showing you a part of the video, but it's important because they allowed them to keep all the information that they discovered. It allowed them to have ownership of what they found so they could do with it what they wanted to. And some of this video, you're going to see a guy with gray hair who talks. He's one of the guys in the room. He's one of the 9, okay? And he's going to be telling his story firsthand. Now, I watched a TED Talk from him that he said one of the things that drove me crazy is how the media and the publicity covered this and shared lie after lie after lie after lie. He said, but I was allowed to keep my information, so I spent the last 32 years making sure people will know the truth. Okay, with that in mind, here's some of the newest things that have come out of the shroud since 2021. From the beginning.
In early 2018, researchers in Rome unveiled a 3D carbon copy of what Jesus looked like, based on measurements of the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot linen cloth that is believed to have wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. The statue is a three-dimensional representation in actual size of the man of the shroud, created following the precise measurements taken from the cloth. Giulio Fanti, a professor of mechanical and thermal measurements and a scholar of the Shroud of Turin, used his own measurements of the impression on the shroud to create the carbon copy. Professor Fanti has studied the shroud for the last 20 years and led the research team that created the 3D model of Jesus. Based off the model, they are able to tell he was nearly 5 feet 11 inches tall, whereas the average height at the time was around 5 feet 5 inches tall. Researchers believe that they finally have the precise image of what Jesus looked like. And based on the marks on the Shroud of Turin, Jesus received a total of at least 600 blows. The sculpture of his tortured body reflects these wounds. Professor Fanti said, I counted 370 wounds without taking into account the wounds on his sides, which the shroud does not show because it only enveloped the back and the front of the body. We can therefore hypothesize a total of at least 600 blows. Professor Fanti goes on to say, we have studied for years the image left by the body on the sheet, using the most sophisticated 3D technologies, and the statue is the final result. The University of Padua and Padua Hospital worked in collaboration with sculptor Sergio Rodella to create the life-size image. Now, I read about 20 different articles on this topic, hoping to read about how they made the actual 3D copy itself. What technique or machine did they use? Did they sculpt it by hand, or did they use some kind of 3D printer? But not one article or video covers that information. However, I found another video from July 2017 of a 3D statue made out of bronze, and the statue itself is, from what I can tell from the video, identical to the 3D carbon copy statue, as his pose and marks on the body look the same. They explain the process in making the statue in the About section on that video, and this is what they said. The shroud is encoded with 3D information that is found from the spaces between the highest and lowest points of the body and its distance from the cloth. Recently, a VP8 analyzer that gives topographical information about the Moon and Mars terrain was used on the cloth. A 3D holographic image was formed of the face and body. An artist then used the exact dimensions of the 3D shroud image to create a bronze replica of the physical form of Jesus Christ.
We have real blood, proven scientifically. We have an image that's neither painted, nor photographed, nor scorched, nor rubbed, or in any way made by the hand of a man. The image on the shroud is definitely not manufactured, meaning made intentionally to fool us.
He's the scientist that's in the room.
This shroud has been wrapped around the body of a man who was tortured, flagellated, crowned with thorns, crucified at the time of the Roman Empire. All of which corresponds to what the Gospels tell us concerning Jesus.
The Shroud of Turin provides a great challenge for science. It's a challenge because it's a piece of cloth that contains an image with physical properties unlike any other image I have ever seen, or anyone has ever seen. I have spent 32 years studying it. 32 years, half my life studying it, and yet I still don't have the answers. The man I worked with from Los Alamos called me again, and he said, "Barry, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I laughed. I said, "But I'm Jewish." And he said, "Me too." He was also Jewish. And he said, and explained to me that at that point, a number of scientists had taken a photo of the shroud, and he said they were so amazed that this image has such properties, they were going to put together a team of scientists to see if they could get permission to go to Turin and examine the shroud to try and determine how this image was formed. About 2 months into the project, I remember saying to one of the other team members, "What is a Jewish boy like me doing on this?" And he laughed and he said, "You forgot that the man on the shroud is Jewish?" And I said, "No, I know this, I know." And then he gave me the best advice, maybe, of my whole life. He said, "Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." And this was great advice. And that kept me on the team. I was going to quit. But because of his words, from God maybe, through his lips, I stayed on the team. But the most important property of the shroud's image is the fact that the distance between the cloth and the body made the density of the image change. So the closer it was, the darker the image. The further away, the lighter the image. So the image on the shroud is not just from contact, because it worked at a distance from the body. So the correlation of cloth to body distance yielded different densities of the image. So when we looked at it with the VP8, we saw the natural relief of a human form. Now, how do we make images like that? We cannot duplicate this. And this three-dimensional information is the only image in the world that has this property.
This image imprinted on the shroud was revealed in even more detailed relief in 2005, when it was transformed into a three-dimensional image. This was achieved by Dr. Soons, a doctor in Panama in Central America, who specializes in three-dimensional imaging.
The thing that stopped me from accepting the shroud as authentic for years, 18 years, the blood on the shroud is still red. Old blood should be black or brown. And no one could answer for 18 years, why is the blood on the shroud still red? And then in 1995, in a telephone conversation with Dr. Alan Adler, Jewish blood chemist, who proved, by the way, the blood on the shroud was blood. Proved it. He and I were on the telephone just having a conversation. And then he told me something I'd never known before. When someone is tortured over an extended period of time, 24 hours, 36 hours, right around the time of Jesus' torture, the body goes into shock. Jesus was given no water, he was beaten, he was scourged. Consequently, he went into anaphylactic shock. After a period of time in this type of shock, the cell walls of the red blood cells begin to break down. And the liver floods the body, the bloodstream, with an enzyme called bilirubin. And when that happens, the blood stays red forever. And when I found that out, that was the last piece of the puzzle. And that pushed me over the threshold and allowed me to accept the shroud as authentic, because it gave me a scientific, credible answer to the last question I had. My life is better by 1,000% than before, because the shroud is in my life. So as a Jew, maybe the greatest irony from my life, I'm a Jew who can say that my faith in God was restored by my study of the Shroud of Turin.
The clues that have been brought to light by the scientific research now made a medical examination of the image on the shroud possible. This examination revealed that this man had indeed been subjected to torture and that he had died by crucifixion.
We don't see a man that's just dead. We see a man whose face is swollen because his face was beaten. And you can actually see one cheek is more swollen than the other, but both are. There are scourge marks from a Roman flagrum, which was a whip with 3 leather thongs, and at the end of each was a lead weight that's shaped like a dumbbell, the weightlifters use. And his body is covered with these scourge marks, over 120.
In flagellation, as applied by the Romans, the blows not only tore the skin, but, as a result of their energy, which was absorbed in a few microseconds, they caused extremely serious internal lesions.
Extrêmement grave. C'est une torture abominable.
It is truly a horrible torture.
C'est un homme qui est là.
This was a man who, at the end of the scourging, was going to die. His kidneys had ceased to function. He was losing liters of blood. He was completely dehydrated. The man on the cross had no more than a few hours left.
Quelques heures.
More amazingly, those crucifixion wounds in the hands, the bloodstains on the shroud show crucifixion through the wrist. Because the Romans knew if they crucified in the palm, you could tear it loose. But if they nail you here, and the nail comes here, you can never pull this loose. We also see bloodstains covering his head, as if from a cap or crown of thorns. But not the beautiful things that the artists show us. Oh, the Roman soldiers were not going to take the time to weave a beautiful crown. They took a bush of thorns and smashed it onto his head, causing bleeding all over his head.
Chaque épine.
Every thorn that touched his flesh would have been like an electric shock for a few seconds or even several minutes. We can hardly imagine this when we read in the Gospels they crucified him.
And we see a wound on his side. The darkest blood stain on the entire shroud is from this wound. And the blood actually went around to his back. So we have this bloody cloth with all these wounds, and it is a perfect match to what it tells in the Gospels was done to Jesus.
C'est Jésus.
This is Jesus.
C'est son témoignage.
This is his testimony. Here is what I have done for you.
Voilà.
Here is what the Gospels say. Here is what I am saying. I confirm them. Here is what I have done.
I was completely overwhelmed because a naked body, which had been tortured with traces of blood,
All right, that goes on for about 35 more minutes with different things, but that's the part I want to show you. I'll send the link to the entire thing when we send out video Sunday. But just a question is it enough? Is it enough? Is it enough Old Testament prophecy? Is it enough New Testament prophecy? Is it enough scientific proof? I bring that in because sometimes we feel like we need that even in spiritual matters. Let me tell you a few other things, because one of the things they said really fast was everything was fulfilled that is said about Christ on the shroud. There was a crown on his head. There was a piercing on his hands or wrist. And what's great about it, and I heard this 30 years ago, when they talked about the wrist, I was like, well, that's interesting, because that does make sense. If you put it here, you can pull that out and get out. You know, the word for hands can also be translated, the direct word, to wrist. So we just translated it to hand. It also means wrist. So that fulfills it. He was scourged, which that shows. His side was pierced, which that shows. And he was buried quickly, which that shows. And here's why we say that is because everything wasn't in the shroud that was supposed to be in the shroud for a Jewish man to be buried. It only had a few things. There's a few flowers that you see if you go far enough through this video in the image. Those flowers, 2 of them are only found in Jerusalem. The material in the shroud is only found in Jerusalem. They had a botanist test the shroud, and the pollen spores he found were from plants only in Jerusalem. Okay, is it enough? I mean, when does it become enough? Now, here's the crazy thing is there's people who will still argue and doubt this because carbon-14 dating, which is, wherever you want it to be, ranges the date. They had 3 individual groups test this, and I'll give you the full thing. But they tested it, and all 3 said, well, this shroud was made between 1250 and 1350, and it shows up in 1353, and they don't know the origin except for the knight who gave it to the authority, and the queen and the king, whatever, said this is the actual shroud of Christ. But it literally, as they go on in this to say, has an image that has the properties of a photo negative, has the properties of an X-ray, and has the properties of a 3D hologram, but is actually none of those. As you go farther, he says the blood was placed first on the shroud. The image actually sits on top of the blood. And it just keeps going. And it would take more faith, I think, to believe that this isn't the shroud than it is to believe that it is. But let me give you one more thing and we're done, okay? Turn to John 20. Another account of what actually happened in the tomb after the resurrection. Just want you to see this. We were going to do an invitation song. We're not going to. We should. We're going to play it. Hang around if you want to. I'll be here. But stay and sing if you want to, but you don't have to. But turn to John 20. I love this passage. Anyway, we brought it up on Easter several years ago. It says this, if you go to John 20, verse 3. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running. But the other disciple outran Peter, reached the tomb first. He bent over, looked inside at the strip of linen or strips of linen lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as a burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went inside and saw and believed, even though they didn't understand. What two things were left in the tomb for us possibly to have a knowledge of the resurrection? Strip, shroud, and the face cloth folded up. Two separate items. You know what they also have a relic of is the face cloth of Jesus Christ in one of the other cathedrals. You know what they did when they took that face cloth, and they put it underneath the shroud? It matched exactly. The two items